The Great and Secret Show. Very interesting one from Barker. Very, very interesting piece of work. The first book in a series that has yet to be completed and most likely will never be completed at this point, unfortunately. This is the first in a series called The Books of the Art. And the Books of the Art are a very peculiar project for Barker. They seem to mark a transition period from when Barker was living in the UK to when he was living in the USA. One thing you will notice from Clive Barker's works from this era, from this period, is that he demonstrates a kind of love-hate relationship with the USA. He has a certain fascination with the history and the unspoken mythology of the USA, and that's what these books are an expression of. They're fascinating, absolutely fascinating. They also mark a transition away from the more horrific subject matter of his earlier career to pretty much entrenched, very, very dark fantasy with science fiction elements. I mean, it's very problematic. As I mentioned before, Barker's fiction is very, very, very difficult to quantify and to categorize. Very difficult indeed, which you will notice if you go to any bookstore that has Clive Barker's work. You will find examples of it all over the place. You'll find it in children's fiction. You'll find things like The Thief of Always and The Aberrat. In the horror section, you'll find The Books of Blood and The Damnation Game. In the fantasy section, you'll find The Great and Secret Show and Galilee and Imagica and Weave World. And in the science fiction section, you may find specimens of The Great and Secret Show, of Everville, of, again, possibly of Weave World, of Imagica once again. It's very difficult to quantify, and that's part of its strength. It's also part of its weakness, of course. There is a potential for Barker's work to be so diverse, to be so lacking in categorization, that it alienates those demographics that want very particular things from their fiction. He's most often associated with the likes of Stephen King and James Herbert and Ramsey Campbell, who are much more positively identified with horror, although all of them have done things outside of that particular genre. King in particular, King is, when you delve into King's earlier work, he spreads himself very, very far and wide. He's got works of fiction in almost any genre you can possibly name, with the possible exceptions of erotica, because he doesn't really like that. But The Great and Secret Show is almost like a culmination of those diverse elements. You get all of the fantastical weirdness of Weave World, all of the really dense, visceral horror of The Books of Blood and The Damnation Game, the high metaphysics of Galilee. It's a very, very peculiar piece of work, but also kind of riveting. It's the kind of book, it's probably one of Barker's most readable book, certainly one of his longer novels, and this is a long one. It's a good old hefty chunk of text, that one, weighing in at 698 pages in this publication. It's a big old book, but it doesn't feel like one. It hurtles along because it has so many things going on, so many diverse plot threads and so many ideas. That's what really distinguishes Barker's fiction from a lot of people writing in the same genres at around the same time. There's a lot of popular fiction around the same era that, what's perfectly fine in and of itself, there's nothing innately wrong with it, is not doing anything terribly challenging. It is playing to an established audience. It knows what its audience wants and it gives it to them, and that's the end of that. It follows very formulaic templates, so you know more or less what is going to happen in most of these works. From the first instance, you know what character's going to live, you know what characters are going to die, you know what the outcome is going to be. That's not the case with Barker's fiction, and certainly not here. It is so ambiguous. The whole thing is so ambiguous. You get that classic Barker thing going on in this book of protagonists becoming antagonists, then becoming bit part supporting characters. then quickly becoming protagonists again. Characters slip and slide all over the place depending upon their status. It's really fascinating, as do the ideas that inform the book. The book is so dense with concepts, it's actually very difficult to unpick. It is a mythology, a postmodern mythology for the USA. In that regard, it is very akin to Neil Gaiman's American Gods. There is something thematically, if not in terms of subject and tone and whatnot, there is something thematically similar going on, which is interesting considering that that Gaiman is also a British writer who moved to the USA, and again seems to exhibit this fascination with his adopted homeland, an outsider's fascination for the mythologies that people who are perhaps born there don't necessarily perceive, that are too innate to its processes to be perceived. Fascinating stuff, absolutely fascinating. It's an odd book. It's a really odd piece of work. It's odd for a number of reasons. First of all, for the previously mentioned fact that the characters are all over the place. They slip slide all over the place. They begin it begins with a man named Randolph Jaff, who is one of my favourite characters in most of Barker's fiction. I really, really like Randolph Jaff. And Randolph Jaff is nobody. He is absolutely nobody. The book goes out of its way to make sure you are aware that Randolph Jaff is wretched, put upon. He's sort of middle-aged and he hasn't done anything with his life whatsoever. He is the perpetual victim. He is the lost child of the USA. He's a guy who works alone in a posting office, in a sorting office. He works in it's called the dead letters room, and it's where all of the parcels and packages and letters that get lost in the postal system that have nowhere to go end up ultimately for examination and ultimate incineration. And that's what he does with his days. He sorts through the dead letters and the dead parcels. He takes out what might be useful or significant and gets rid of the rest. And he rather enjoys it, despite the fact that he is a lost man. He's a man who has no hope. He's a man who has no tomorrow. He doesn't perceive any kind of tomorrow. He's a normal guy. He is a normal, isolated, depressed guy. That's all he is. Not some great sorcerer, not some occultist, no one who has high ideas or anything to that effect. Until he starts to notice something. There's a pattern in the letters. There's something happening across the face of the USA, something unspoken, some kind of unspoken communication that occurs in codes and ciphers and symbols and metaphors. It is the ultimate conspiracy theorist story, this book. It takes the notion, the very USA, the very American notion of there being conspiracies that underlie public discourse, that underlie overt political and cultural process, and just runs with it. It expands it to the nth degree. There is this communication happening via letters and packages and parcels that he starts to unravel, he starts to notice, and he starts to decipher. Now, how he can decipher it and why is left generally vague, but it is implied that there may be something else working here, that perhaps something wants him to unpick and interpret and unravel it. But he becomes obsessed by it, and he starts to notice this secret life of the USA, that there are these occult and metaphysical forces at play across the face of the USA and the wider world. There's a conspiracy to keep waking humanity ignorant of particular secrets, of secrets that were the rest of humanity to know about them, it would drive the entire species mad, would potentially tear open reality, it would cause reality to melt. There is a group, a cabal or coven of occultists and philosophers and scientists and sorcerers called the Shoal. And the Shoal concerns itself with A, keeping humanity ignorant, whilst also conducting its own explorations and experiments into these other states, into the dream life of humanity, which takes place in a state that is simultaneously physical and simultaneously metaphysical. It is both a metaphor and a physical place. It's very peculiar. A place called Quiddity. And Quiddity is the sea of dreams. It's the sea of potential. It is the sea of ideas from which all things spring, ultimately. Before anything, there is the dream or the idea of it. There is the abstract of it. And Quiddity is the source of that. And scattered amongst across the surface of Quiddity, which is potentially infinite, is the ephemeris, islands or states of being, of which our world is just one. And the shoal don't entirely know how Quiddity works or what's out there, but they're simultaneously obsessed and afraid by it. So they keep humanity away from it. Even though all human beings go there, all human beings, according to the mythology of this book, go there at particular points in their lives, at least twice. They go there when they're born, the first night they sleep outside of the womb. They go there if and when they fall in love, on the first night they sleep next to their lover, and they go there the night before they die. And they forget, of course. They drift in the dream sea. Within Quiddity, they experience revelations and transformations they couldn't even conceive of while they're awake. And for sanity's sake, they forget when they wake up. Although there may be some significant changes to their psyches, that's what Randolph Jaff discovers, and he becomes obsessed with it, becomes absolutely obsessed with it. And after murdering his boss, fulfilling the American dream, he goes off on this shamanistic quest across the face of the USA, searching for secrets, learning forbidden things. He becomes not only an occultist, but a sorcerer. He finds that he has an almost preternatural nose for this kind of material, for people who exhibit strange powers and capacities, and he seeks them out, and he learns things, and he becomes very knowledgeable, and he becomes very powerful. Doesn't find any members of the shoal. They're too secretive. They're too capable of keeping people away from themselves, but he does meet a guy called Kissoon. And Kissoon is a very strange guy. He operates in what seems to be a kind of pocket dimension, which he draws the Randolph Jaff into. It's a sort of desert space and an empty town, and he tries to coerce or to trick Randolph into something that Randolph isn't entirely aware of. And fortunately for Randolph, he's aware of it, so he manages to get away. And that's the last we see of Kissoon for a little while. One man who does meet along his esoteric path is a man named Richard Wesley Fletcher. Now, Fletcher is almost the diametric opposite of Jaff. Whereas Jaff is occultism and mystery and secrets and conspiracies, Fletcher is science and physics and reason and rationality. He is, however, a disgraced scientist. His ideas are so out there, his theories are so abstruse that he has no place in the scientific community. And as such, he's entirely disgraced. He's also addicted to mescaline, which probably doesn't help. But between them, they combine their disciplines and they create something. They create this means of fast-forwarding human evolution, I suppose. It's a substance. It's a substance that's part chemical and part metaphysics. It's part a dream and part an actual stuff. It's an actual substance, and it's alive. It's also living. They call it the nuncio after a character in Shakespeare, which means the messenger, because it speeds the message of evolution from cell to cell. However, what they don't anticipate, either of them, is that it doesn't just work on the flesh. It doesn't just inspire evolution in the cells of whatever it touches. It inspires evolution towards the abstract, certainly in human beings, creatures that can dream, that can envisage idealizations of themselves. That's what it speeds them towards. It makes human beings into divinities and demigods. And Fletcher finds this out, and he goes to destroy it. He doesn't want Jaff anywhere near it. He goes to destroy it, but the Nuncio knows. It's wise to him, and it bursts out of its container, and it spatters over him, and it works on him. It transforms Fletcher into this vaguely ephemeral entity, this dusty thing of dreams and sunlight. And the Jaff arrives shortly after and consciously takes some of it into himself, and also ends up becoming an abstract entity, a divinity. But whereas Fletcher becomes this dreaming entity of ideas and abstractions and of dreaming better dawns for tomorrow, the Jaff finds the aspects of his personality emphasized. He becomes the Jaff. He becomes this demonic force of secrets and shadows and mystery and fear and sweat. And they become these warring principles that battle across the face of the USA invisibly for the collective soul of humanity. What the Jaff wants to do is rip reality open, and he has the means now. He wants to tear open reality and open the way to quiddity, and the means of doing that is a principle called the art. The art is this, it's a very vague concept, it's an abstract notion, but it is the means of bridging the gap between the physical and the dream world, between the abstract and the material. And the Nuncio is a way of fast forwarding that process. And Fletcher knows that if the Jaff gets through to quiddity, if he manages to touch the dream sea, he will pollute it with his love of secrets, with his mystery, his darkness. He will pollute the dreaming lives of humanity. So he tries to stop him. They engage in this decade-long war across the face of the USA, which is never seen. Not physically, but it does have ramifications for the waking world and for those living there. And eventually they end up burying one another, grasped together in this embrace that's almost like, it's like an inversion of a lover's embrace. It's an embrace of absolute pure antithesis beneath a synthetic town called Palamo Grove. And I say synthetic in the sense that it's a town that was constructed with regards to a very specific plan. There's no tradition there. Everything is contrived. It's a planned out town, as many towns in the USA of the era were. And they explode from their prison beneath the town several decades later, and end up making weapons of some of the town's children. They actually, and it's a fairly terrible thing, they actually both end up raping some of the girls from the town, which Fletcher hates. Fletcher, he resists but can't stop himself because he has to fight the Jaff. And if Jaff has weapons, then he needs weapons too. And they end up siring these children, through which they hope they will continue waging their war. It doesn't obviously work out entirely like that. Two of the children, one from the Jaff and one from Fletcher, end up meeting and falling in love, which does not go down terribly well. Others don't make it. They end up going mad, they end up dying, they end up being aborted, and so on and so forth. But eventually, both Jaff and Fletcher get out. They get out, and they start waging their war in a more traditional manner. And the way they do it is by the Jaff finds people, and he makes monsters out of their darkest drives, out of their unspoken desires, their taboo lusts, their fears, their dreads, what makes them sweat at night. That's what he makes, monsters, a cavalcade of incredible monsters called the Terrata. Whereas Fletcher does the opposite. He makes followers and soldiers out of people's dreams and fantasies, out of what gives them hope. What I find really interesting about this book is that as a metaphysical exercise, it's actually quite nihilistic. but something it takes great pains to point out is that Fletcher's armies are infinitely weaker than the Jaffs. The Jaffs, the terrors and the unspoken, sublimated, neurotic drives of the people of Palamo Grove and of the wider USA are much stronger, much more defined than its fantasies. Fletcher makes fantasies out of they conjure up soap stars and porn stars and characters from soap operas, superheroes, things like that. Whereas the Tirata are much more idiosyncratic, much more their own entities, and simply stronger. And there's more of them. There are more of them. So it's a war that Fletcher can't win. It's a war that Fletcher cannot win. So he has to go about things in a much more ingenious and insidious manner. And that's what the book explores. It explores their war across the face of Palamo Grove and how there are other forces at work influencing what they do, how there are members of the Shoals still around, how Kissoon has orchestrated all of this from his little space beyond time and space. It's a very, very fascinating, multi-threaded, almost Hydra-like story that does come together at the end to a conclusion, not an entire one, not a complete one. This is more the story of Palamo Grove more than anything, and that's the story that's tied up here, as is ostensibly the mythology between the Jaff and Fletcher. There is a kind of conclusion to that here. What it does not conclude is the mythology of Quiddity, of the Shoal, of Kissoon, and the wider stuff that goes on, which is picked up again in Everville, which is we'll be exploring very, very soon. It's a fascinating piece of work. It's dense. The ideas are very, very dense. The images are extreme and overt and surreal, as you'd expect from Barker. It has some of the most ugly, disgusting, horrific material that you'll find in a Barker book. I mean, Kissoon can create entities called the Licks, and the Licks are, the very concept of them is gross. It's really disgusting. I'll let you read it. I'm not going to spoil that particular surprise. It's deeply, deeply unpleasant. But I like the commentary that it provides. I like the fact that it's ostensibly a fantasy book. It's a metaphysical fantasy book that is not preoccupied with notions of salvation, with notions of hope, with very sort of Judeo-Christian or Abrahamic notions. It's an entirely other mythology, this, that mixes into itself elements of certain philosophies, certain traditional mythologies, science and metaphysics and cosmology, and all sorts of weird and wacky and wonderful stuff. So many disciplines and principles all coming together to make this story. It's phenomenally clever, as most of Barker's works from this era are. It is phenomenally clever and very beautiful. More than that, it's very readable. It's one of Barker's, it's not like, say, Sacrament. Sacrament is a wonderful book. It's absolutely wonderful. It's one of my favourites, but it is phenomenally dense, not only in terms of its ideas and imagery, but in terms of the way it's written, as is Imagica, which can make them difficult to read. This isn't. You can read 400 pages of this and it just flies by because it's so engaging. It's like that cover. That cover is perfect for this book because that is the story. It's so vibrant. There's so many colours leaping off the page at you, and the dynamics of the story are great. The oppositions, the juxtapositions between Fletcher and Jaff, which upset themselves, which actually invert themselves at one point. It isn't what you would expect. It is not the case that Fletcher is unambiguously the good guy and that Jaff is unambiguously the bad guy. No. Barker has as much sympathy and empathy for the Jaff as he does for Fletcher. In fact, the way he presents Jaff and his Tirata is arguably more loving and more detailed than Fletcher. He tends to portray Fletcher as a bit effete and as a bit impotent, to be honest. Fletcher's kind of impotent in this story, which is really kind of cool, because that would not be the case if this kind of story were written by a more traditional author. It just wouldn't be the case. That's what you get from Barker. You get that wonderful subversion of ideas and tropes and concepts, and certainly of character archetypes. if this were written by a more traditional writer, then there would be a resolution. There would be something at the end where Fletcher pulls something out of the bag, some miracle, something that the Jaff missed in his hubris, in his ego, and order would be restored. Doesn't happen. Does not happen. The end of this book is a downer. It's a real downer. As is the case for a lot of Barker's more metaphysical stuff, and that's good. That's good. It's not afraid. It's not afraid of upsetting its audience's desire for hope, which can be an infantile and prescribed thing. Doesn't give you that, and I applaud it for it. The next book in this series is Everville. I'm not sure whether we're going to do that next, though. I've got to hang... maybe we will. Maybe we'll do Everville next. Maybe we'll do Galilee, which, by the way, is another series that isn't finished and will likely never, ever, 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 ever be finished at this point. I would kill for another book of the art. I really would. I love this mythology. I really, really do. And it could do with tying up. I think there should be 4 books, ultimately, in this series. But I don't think there's going to be at this point, which is kind of sad. That said, if you don't mind the fact that the mythology is not finished and will never be finished, these are great reads. Both The Great and Secret Show and Everville. Fabulous, fabulous reads. Very powerful, very ambiguous and subtle and unsettling. Exactly what you want from a Barker book.